Good afternoon. This is Catherine Hazelrig, Assistant Director of Communications at Council of Graduate Schools. We are delighted to welcome you to our webinar today. Excellent PhD completion rates, but what about the graduate outcomes with Rachel Spronken-Smith? I'm going to go through a couple technical slides really quickly and then turn it over to CGS President Suzanne Ortega.
Well, colleagues, very happy new year to you. I hope that 2018 is off to a good start, and we are really pleased and welcome you to join us for our first CGS webinar in 2018. And we are really fortunate this year to begin our webinar series with a research presentation from our New Zealand colleague, Professor Rachel Spronken-Smith, who is here at CGS for about a week or a week and a half as part of her Fulbright scholarship. We first got to know Rachel and her work as an attendee of last year's Global Summit. Rachel has been Dean of the Graduate Research School at the University of Otago, Dunedin, New Zealand, since 2013. Initially, she was trained as a geographer and completed her PhD at the University of British Columbia in the mid-1990s. After gaining a postgraduate diploma in tertiary teaching, Rachel changed her academic career and accepted a position as a senior lecturer in higher education at the University of Otago in 2004. Her current research interests in higher education include undergraduate research and inquiry, curriculum change, graduate outcomes, and in the more recent years to doctoral education itself. In today's webinar, Excellent PhD Completion Rates, but what about graduate outcomes? Rachel will discuss her recent research on both PhD completion rates and graduate outcomes for cohorts at the University of Otago. Rachel, we're so glad you're here. We look forward to this webinar, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and particular thanks to CGS for the opportunity to come and visit. I think you're very fortunate to have a group like this supporting graduate education in the US. Being a geographer, I had to include a map. So here's a map of New Zealand. Most people flying to the country will arrive in Auckland in the north, but Otago is circled here, the province of Otago. Many of you will know it from Lord of the Rings country. But on the coast is Dunedin. That's the main location for our university campus, but we also have other campuses in Christchurch and Wellington. In Dunedin, though, it's known as the wildlife capital of New Zealand. We enjoy an amazing coastal backdrop with royal albatross, a couple of species of penguin and sea lions and seals. And the city itself was established about the 1840s and has some really lovely examples of Victorian architecture, including the railway station here and one of our churches. Right, but to our study. The first study I'm going to talk about concerns PhD completion rates. And I would just like to start with this quote from Burke and colleagues back in 2004. Attrition rates and time to completion of PhD candidates has internationally become a concern of government, universities and the candidates themselves. If we look at some data around PhD completion rates, we can see that there are sparse reports from a range of countries. So the first one there was actually one of the CGS studies from a few years ago, PhD completion study. And there the report was 46% complete after 7 years and 57% after 10 years. Now they were for cohorts 1992 to 95. Canada, for some earlier cohorts, reported rates of 40 to 83%. In the UK, more recent work by Fuller has reported 70 to 87% for full-time candidates. And in Australia, a couple of studies, one by Burke and colleagues, 70% completion in 6 years, whereas Palmer more recently said 62 to 72% for the top 10 universities. New Zealand really doesn't have any published data at the institutional level, but buried in a report around research funding was this statistic around 60% completion rate in 9 years. Now, one of the difficulties comparing these studies is that, well, firstly, there's a real lack of published data. Secondly, the data tend to be quite dated. And thirdly, it's quite difficult to make comparisons as some different measures are used in these different institutions and countries. In our study, these are the definitions that we adopted. Firstly, submission percentage, the percentage of candidates from a cohort who submit a thesis for examination. And secondly, completion percentage. This is the percentage of candidates who complete and are awarded a PhD. It's interesting to note that often studies report a completion percentage, but really they're talking about submission. Now, we found in our study actually there's a couple of percentage points difference between the two, because not all who submit will actually pass their exam. The third definition here is candidacy time. This is the time from enrolment to submission of the thesis for exam, and it excludes periods of deferral or temporary suspension. Then we've got completion time, time from enrolment to the award of the degree, and that will include any periods of deferral and the examination period. The other study I'm going to talk about concerns graduate attributes, and this is quite a, oh, I've just realised it says a very large year there, it's 2000, is that reference? So this is quite a well-known reference by Bowden, that graduate attributes are the qualities, skills and understandings a university community agrees that its students should develop during their time with the institution. There's been a lot of research on graduate attributes in undergraduate programs, but really not a lot for doctoral programs, and even less research on actually evaluating whether students are actually attaining the graduate attributes we hope they will. So I've abbreviated that to GAS throughout the presentation. So just a couple of studies I cite here. The first one was a study in France. They used a survey to determine core competencies, and they discovered 6 of these core competencies: knowledge and technical skills, transferable competencies that can be formalised, such as communication, innovation and project management, transferable competencies that cannot be formalised, such as cognitive abilities and teamwork, dispositions including rigour, creativity and autonomy, and behaviours such as perseverance, and metacompetencies such as capacity for adaptation. They said that it's dangerous though, and I agree with them, to try and reduce the notions of doctorateness to a list of attributes that actually it's a more complete set. But nevertheless, for conversations around what we expect of our doctoral students, it's quite a helpful way to go. Then there's some work out of Australia, quite a few studies actually. One I'm just citing here, the Manathonga and her colleagues in 2009. They found that many candidates actually develop these attributes prior to PhD study through their previous education or public speaking, work and life experiences. They were particularly interested in whether students in cooperative research centres had a better skill set, and found that they were, that they did get greater exposure to a range of attributes that were helpful for the workplace, but still many were saying that PhD study had not prepared them well for employment. They wanted better career planning and experiential learning opportunities. So against this backdrop are the 2 sort of broad research aims for the 2 studies. So the first one is around PhD completion data and looking at factors influencing those. And then the second study is around employment pathways for PhD graduates and looking at the development and application of attributes by PhD candidates. So I'll go through the first one and then we'll have a break for a Q&A before moving on to the second. Both of them are case studies from the University of Otago. It's the oldest in New Zealand. It was established in 1869. It's research intensive, also excellent in teaching, and we took out all the top measures of student retention and engagement amongst the 8 universities last year. It has about 21,000 students, and included in that are about 1,300 PhD candidates and about 45% international. We have a QS rating of 5-star plus. A little bit of context for PhDs at Otago, because it is a very different system in New Zealand than it is in North America. The entry to PhD is from an honours degree. That is typically a 3-year bachelor's followed by 1-year honours degree at postgraduate level. And that 1 year would include coursework and a dissertation. Or a master's degree, and again that would typically include 1 year coursework and then 1 year of thesis research, although these days we have a range of master's degrees available, some of which are more heavily coursework oriented. But to get into a doctoral program there has to be a substantive research component. We allow continuous enrolment, people can start at any time. The tuition fees are around $4,000 to $7,000 a year, and international PhD students pay domestic fees. So this was a government policy brought in 2006 and has resulted in a very high international cohort. At Otago we offer 180 doctoral scholarships of about $17,000 US, plus fees for a maximum of 3 years. And then if students complete in under 4 years, they will gain a postgraduate publishing bursary, which is 3 months funding at the scholarship rate to write up publications from their thesis. So importantly, PhDs in New Zealand are research only, and so they're 3 to 4 year degrees, no required coursework, or very seldom is coursework required. Right, so the method for the completion study, we did a quantitative analysis of institutional data for cohorts from 2000 to 2012. We extracted the data at the end of January 2015. So I'm going to show you both some descriptive statistics for all those cohorts, so the total sample is 2,770, and results from a survival analysis, which is a type of regression modelling, looking at submission rates and putting in variables of gender, citizenship, age at admission, the broad disciplinary area or division, as we call them, enrolment status and scholarship status. First though, just looking at some of those descriptive statistics for those PhD cohorts, so a series of graphs here with the years along the bottom from 2000 to 2012 and number of enrolments on the y-axis. So we can see here we more or less had a steady increase, bit of a peak in 2006 when that policy changed around international students, dropped off a bit and has sort of been fairly steady, well, plateauing out a bit through to 2012. Since then we've had a gradual increase, I would say. This one's showing the breakdown of gender. Women in red and men in blue, slightly more women, just over 50%, but roughly half and half. The enrolment status, this one is a bit harder to get your head around, but if we just look at 2012, the red is full-time, the blue is part-time, and green is variable. So most students would start as full-time, about 90%, and only about 5 to 6% would be part-time all the way through their PhD. Once the 3-year scholarship has finished, some students will opt to go part-time, and that leads to that variable category. So that's why if we look back over time, we can see increasing proportion of variable students on this variable enrolment, which would involve periods of both full-time and part-time enrolment. The citizenship status, the domestic students there in blue, and the green illustrates the international students. So we can see again around 2006 we had quite a jump there, and that's been fairly consistently growing and is now around about 45%. And the broad disciplinary groupings, Otago has most disciplines except for engineering, so there's no engineering and no architecture, but otherwise most disciplines are covered. So we can see here the science in the top sort of lighter blue is around about 30% of the cohort. Humanities in the slightly darker blue is about 22%, and then we have health science in the purple is the majority, about 38% of our candidates, and then quite a small cohort in our commerce faculty, around sort of 8 to 10%. Right, so here's the completion data for the PhD cohorts from 2000 to 2012, and we can see the years again along the bottom, and then up on the y-axis the percentage of the commencing cohort. So if we look at those that are completed in the green, we can see that particularly if you look at the period 2000 to 2005, we expect all of those people either to have completed or left the program altogether. And we can see here that there are quite high completion rates here, from sort of about 78 through to about 88%, and a slight difference between submission and completion. So there is a slight drop-off. A couple of percent will not complete their exam. So they may receive a failed first exam, a revise and resubmit, and then some of those candidates will never turn in a revised thesis, and some may turn in a revised thesis and fail that second exam. So our withdrawal rates there for that period quite low, sort of 11 to about 23% is the high in 2002. And the closer we get to the time of the census period, we can see that there is still some continuing in the program. So if we look at the stats across the cohorts though, we can see that 83% of all candidates, that's the average percentage that submit for exam, with an attrition of 17%. So thinking back to that first slide, that is globally very high, comparable with some of the rates in the UK, and certainly higher than a lot of institutions in the US and in Australia. Full-time cohort is 83%. You'll see there the part-time drops down to 67%, so that is in fact a risk if we allow candidates to be fully part-time for the entire candidature. However, interestingly, the variable enrolment, that was the periods of part-time and full-time, actually that's pretty good strategy, 88% submit. So some colleagues of mine get concerned when students ask to go part-time, having been enrolled full-time for most of their PhD, but actually we know now that this is actually a good strategy for getting them to complete. In terms of gender, slight difference there, more women, or a sort of higher submission percentage for women, 85% compared to men at 82%. Citizenship, our international, slightly higher, and that's quite consistent with other studies. And those on Otago scholarship have a higher average submission as well, 86% compared to 80%. If we look at the disciplinary groups, we can see the highest submission percentages are occurring in health science, 88%, science 84%, humanities 79%, and commerce 74%. But all of them really very high, but commerce is a bit lower. If we then go on to look at how long it's taking them, remembering that we are aiming for completion in around 3 to 4 years, we can see that for all candidates, the candidacy time, that's the time from enrolment to submitting the thesis, is 3.7 years. And the full-timers are doing it in 3.4 years on, that's the median time. So quite fast. Part-timers in calendar years, 5.6 years, but actually if we look at that in terms of equivalent full-time years, that's the Fs, actually it's less than 3 years. Slight concern given that our government have changed the expectations for a minimum of 3 years for a PhD degree, but these part-timers probably, possibly spending more than half time on their PhD, we're not too sure. And then the variable enrolment, as you might expect, because there are periods of part-time and full-time, is coming out at nearly 4.5 years. Gender there, we can see that the men are submitting slightly faster than women. And in terms of citizenship, the internationals are taking about 3.39 years compared to domestics who are about 6 months slower. And funding as well, those on a scholarship tend to submit in 3.5 years, those without funding are close to 4 years. The disciplinary groups give quite a different picture here. Commerce actually comes out on top here at the fastest, 3.49, followed by science and then humanities. And interestingly, health science longer. Possibly partly because of experimental work taking longer, and also they tend to have a higher proportion of part-timers in health science as well. The survival analysis let us sort of do a statistical tests really around whether any of these things were significant, and where there is an asterisk that's indicating significant effect of that particular factor. So enrolment, definitely enrolment was important, and that part-time was a risk in terms of submission rates. So full-timers were 3.7 times more likely, that's how you interpret that hazard ratio, 3.7 times more likely to submit than part-timers. In terms of gender, we had a slight difference there that women were had slightly greater chance of submitting. The age was a negligible influence. The citizenship, internationals again, their submission rates were significantly greater than for domestic students, and those on funding also had significantly higher submission rates. And the academic field there, because the submission rate is taking into account both submission and time, commerce is coming out on top there in terms of 1.5 times higher than humanities, whereas health science were 1.2 times and science about 1.2 as well, times higher than humanities. So disciplinary factors were important as well. So in terms of what are the contributing factors to these high completion rates and fast times, I think mainly having a full-time cohort is important because we saw that part-time is a risk. But allowing periods of part-time enrolment near submission, that can be seen as a good strategy to try and improve the submission rate. Recruiting a large international cohort. Now this might be particular to the New Zealand context, but certainly in New Zealand having the large international cohort tends to help those submission rates. Fees, although fundamentally I'd like there to be no fees to do PhDs, I think the fact that there are fees probably provide a financial imperative to finish in about 3 years, because our scholarships that have that maximum of 3 years, once they run out, students then start paying domestic fees. So that's a financial imperative to complete in close to 3 years. Also, as well as that sort of stick, if you like, we have the carrot of the postgraduate publishing bursary, that if you do submit in under 4 years, they will get this publishing bursary. And we also offer that for master's students too, if they submit in under 1.5 years. We tend to recruit for quality, so we do pay a lot of attention as to who we let into the program in terms of quite strict entry criteria. And then we do have close monitoring during candidature. So all students are on formal progress reporting every 6 months through the first year or so until they get what we call confirmed. That's where they sort of get confirmed into the program. And then after that, it's annual reporting. If any of those progress reports indicate poor performance, they're all read within the graduate research school, so I'm usually knocking on the door of the supervisor to find out what's happening and what can be done to improve the situation. The university also has really good support in terms of surveys of student satisfaction. We find that supervision is really highly rated, so overall students are very happy with supervisors. There are also a range of resources and academic skills development support. Quite uniquely, we have a personal performance coach. This is someone the students can see at any time during candidature. We encourage an early visit to help with time management and goal setting. And particularly if they fall into those doldrums during the PhD and get a bit stuck, again, they will get referred to the coach to help them get out of that situation. The other thing, when I asked students in a seminar, why do they think that we have these really high completion rates, the immediate response was the weather, because the weather, at least on the Dunedin campus, is not well known for its great weather. So they say, instead of going to the beach, of course, we're sitting in our offices working hard on our PhDs. So that was quite a flippant response, but the geographer or the climatology person in me really is quite interested in that, as I suspect there might be an element of interest around the weather as well. Okay, so that is the first part of the presentation, and I'm quite happy to take any questions that you might have around that PhD completion study. Just while we're waiting for questions to come in.
We have one question, yeah. Can you talk more about the personal coach and graduate student stress?
Right. So the coach has been in the school now for about 4 years, and we noticed that certainly when I talk to postgraduates, and I hear this from supervisors or mentors or advisors, depending on what you call them, as well, that they get worried when they see what they think are symptoms of mental health in their students. And often postgraduates, probably similar to undergraduates, quite reluctant to go and see a counsellor. Just the whole stigma of being referred to a student counsellor. But actually, if they're told, well, why don't you go and see a coach, it's quite a positive spin on any issues. And so the coach, because we have a trained counsellor also in that coaching position, not only are they really more focused on coaching, but because of their counselling background, they can identify actually if this person is in need of more counselling support. So it can actually be quite a gentle way into mental health support for students. I've been involved in some other research looking at stress in PhD candidates at Otago, two different studies, and certainly they are at risk of stress, and particularly in that early period we've noticed a range of issues around isolation, uncertainty around doctoral processes, dealing with supervisors and setting up those relationships. So again, this is where if they can go and see that coach early on, they can really help them get off to a really good start. And that's a really key factor.
We have another question about the coaches. Are they compensated, and if so, how much?
So our coaches get paid at a student counselling rate, I think. So we will have a pay scale for our counsellors, and they would get paid at an equivalent rate. Funding them has been quite precarious in our university. We have what's called a student services fee, which covers student health services for our students. So quite a different environment because we don't have the very high need for health insurance in New Zealand. But nevertheless, we do have student health services that are subsidised by the university, but students pay a fee. So we collect some money from that student service levy from students to half fund this position, and the other half comes out of our graduate research school fund. And that role is 0.8 full-time, so 4 days a week they are on the role.
The coaches are very popular questions right now. Someone else would like to know, how are coaches assigned?
So the students self-book. We certainly, any workshops I run, induction workshops for PhD students, I let them know about the coach and we advertise it on our website. But there's an online booking site and the students can just go in and book themselves a session. The coach also runs workshops for students around managing supervisors, avoiding procrastination, various topics that are quite pertinent.
What about financial coaching?
Good question. No, that's not something we've looked at, but that certainly is one of the major sources of stress for our students is in fact financial. So unbeknownst to many students, we have a really good fees office who can provide excellent advice for students. So we tend to refer students there if they have questions, but we don't have a systematic sort of financial coaching service.
Okay. What mentoring strategies has your institution implemented, and which ones have been the most successful?
I would say the most successful one is having a mandatory student supervisor agreement. So within the first 6 months, an agreement must be completed between all students and supervisors. And we do check for that when the first progress report is done at 6 months. It has to have been uploaded by that stage. And part of that agreement, so there is a template provided, can be customised by departments, but one of the key things there, the most important, is a very explicit discussion of expectations of that relationship. So we have a series of statements around aspects of candidature, like for example the first statement is it's the candidate's responsibility to choose the topic for research, and opposite that is a statement saying it is the supervisor's responsibility to choose the topic. So the candidate goes through and rates how their expectations, and independently the supervisor does the same, and then they get together to discuss. That is key, I think, to figuring out where there is a mismatch in expectations. So I would say that's one of the key things. The other thing that we've only instigated more recently, which I think is really helping, is what we call an under-review process. If a candidate at any time is performing unsatisfactorily, then they get referred to the graduate research school. We put them under review if their supervisors are in agreement. This is a 3-month period where they have very strict targets set. It might be completion of a chapter or two, and then at the end of that we assess that work. If it's up to doctoral standard, they carry on in the program, and if it's not, we would look at an exit qualification. So that's sort of been very helpful in trying to weed out, if you like, those who are in the wrong program, or to get people back on track if it's just been a sort of lull in performance.
Great. Along those same lines, so what happens when a student does not follow the agreement? What is the course of action?
That's very interesting. So usually I would get contacted by the supervisor who was quite unhappy if things weren't being followed in that agreement. Of course, it can go both ways. I also get contacted by students who say, the supervisor said that I would get feedback within 3 weeks on my work, and actually this hasn't been happening. So it goes both ways. Usually an intervention by a head of department is enough to get the candidate back on track, or similarly the supervisor. If the supervisor has not been living up to their part of the agreement, I would contact with the student's agreement, I would contact the head of department to intervene and try and improve that performance.
And when do you decide to terminate a student from their program?
So we would give them an opportunity to get back on track. So that's that 3-month under review period. And at the end of that, if they still weren't performing at the level we would expect, we would exit them at that stage. So any time that can be invoked, well, firstly, there's the first year confirmation period. If they're up to standard during that first year, we would do a check then to ensure they're in the right program, so they may be exited after a year, but otherwise we would invoke that under review at any time.
Okay, we have one more question. What type of system do you have in place for monitoring progress of students in the program? Does the monitoring take place at the department level or at the graduate school level?
Okay, it takes place at the graduate school level. We have an online system now that we've just moved to in the last few years. So the student completes some questions online in a central student management system, and then that creates what we call a progress report form. And that gets, within the department, there's a formal meeting chaired by somebody independent to the supervisory team, which is really important. Somebody independent oversees that meeting. And they go through a series of questions about the supervisory relationship and about progress. The progress is evaluated on a 5-point scale. And then at the end of it, that report is signed off by the head of department. It goes to any relevant deans and then ends up in the graduate research school. They're all read, and if there are, I send a congratulatory email to those who are rated as outstanding, and if there are any who are fair or unsatisfactory, I contact supervisors just to make sure, find out something's being done.
Okay, we got a couple more real quick questions. Are your doctoral students teaching undergraduate classes?
Not always. So some of them will get that opportunity, but not all.
Yeah. And in terms of the terminating a student, is the decision taken by the faculty mentor only, or is it decided with the student's committee or graduate college?
It's decided with the student's committee, head of department, and me as dean.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have one last question, and then we are going to move on, but this is on a slightly different topic. When you recruit a large international cohort, what is the role of the faculty supervisor versus the role of the graduate research school?
That's an interesting question. And to complicate it further, we also have an international office. So actually our international office becomes key. They have international advisors, so every international PhD student will have an international advisor who is sort of the first point of contact for them when they arrive in the university, and they're independent to the program, so they just provide more of that pastoral, cultural support. Otherwise, the department would be the main support, And then the graduate school, we're more at the administrative level and oversight of pastoral and academic support.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so there will be an opportunity at the end if there are more questions related to the first part, I'm sure. But we better move on to the second part of the presentation, which is around graduate attributes. So at Otago, we have an institutional graduate profile that consists of 13 attributes, and they're listed in this diagram. And you may wonder why I've got this funny figure with a scarf, but again, Dunedin's weather being a bit on the cool side for much of the year, students wear a lot of scarves in winter, so they're known as scarfies locally. So we've had this profile for a number of years for undergraduates, and only recently were we required to come up with graduate profiles for postgraduates. So the one for PhDs is this profile: specialist knowledge, leadership ability, and highly developed abilities in all of these attributes. So in a way, it was, we just stuck with the institutional profile for undergraduates, but had higher expectations in terms of the level of attainment of those attributes. And obviously the research attribute is something which is quite universal across countries. Original and significant research has to be publishable, mastery of methodology, critical engagement with the literature. But on top of that, we have this whole set of other attributes that we hope our students would obtain. But then how do we know? How do we know whether they are in fact getting these? And that was the motivation for this particular study. So the method for this one, we run a graduate opinion survey. It's based on the Higher Education Academy in the UK, their postgraduate research experience survey. But it also includes some additional locally relevant items, particularly around this graduate profile. The survey is sent out about 18 months after students have completed the requirements of their degree. So in 2015, we were surveying those who graduated in 2014. And we received 136 responses out of 247 invitations, so about a 55% response rate. In terms of what we did with that data, we're really interested in employment outcomes. So wanted to know whether they were employed and what sort of job they were in and who their employer was. And then some descriptive statistics around those items, and open-ended data was coded by the researchers. In terms of the graduate attributes, this is the list of attributes that were asked about in the survey. Now the ones with 2 asterisks were a good match to our graduate attributes in the Otago graduate profile. The ones with 1 asterisk were a reasonable match, and the ones that had no asterisks are ones that had been asked, were part of the survey that had been asked for many years. The survey's been run for a few decades now, so we wanted to keep the same data set going. And actually I'm really pleased we did, because some of the ones that are not explicitly our attributes are actually what we would see now as key capabilities for students. For example, flexibility and adaptability and skills to implement change. So I'm really pleased that they're in there. Importantly, in the survey, the first question was around to what extent do you feel that the PhD encouraged development of each of these attributes during your course of study? And then the second part was to what extent do you feel you have applied each of these attributes in your post-university experience? And students could hover over, in the online survey, they could hover over any of these particular attributes to get a full description of what they were. So it was quite possible some of them had never seen these before, being quite a recent profile. So for example, cultural understanding is the knowing and appreciation of biculturalism within the framework of the Treaty of Waitangi. That's important in New Zealand. Knowledge and appreciation of multiculturalism, and an ability to apply such knowledge in a culturally appropriate manner. So there was more detail for each of these. In terms of who responded, we had a fairly even split between men and women. Around 63% were domestic students and 37% international, and we've got a breakdown of the ethnicity there. Most were European. And 63% had English as their first language. And then if we look at the division, that broad disciplinary area, This was actually quite reflective, more or less, of the breakdown of where PhD students are located in the university. So we can see that most of them were from health sciences and science, and then humanities and commerce. And enrolment status, 84% were full-time, with about 13% part-time. That one comes greater than 100% because some may have started full-time and then switched to part-time distance, so that's why the numbers are a bit greater than 100%. Okay, so if we look at some of the results from this, are you currently employed? We can see that yes, 73% of them are currently employed, full-time, 17% were part-time, and whether they were studying for a further tertiary qualification, we had about 8% of them in some form of study for a further qualification. This one is probably one of the more interesting graphs out of this part of the study, looking at employment outcomes versus the expectations. So this was the career they had in mind when they graduated. So we can see the percentage of respondents along the bottom there, and then the types of careers up the side. So in terms of academic career in higher education, we can see that about 55% had hoped to have an academic career, but at the time of survey, that was 18 months after graduation, 29% were in these. Now, unfortunately, I'm not that happy with the description of academic career in the survey, and I want our evaluation unit to change this, because currently it includes faculty positions but also teaching only positions, so they're bundled together, and I would like those to be separated out, because for some reason they do separate out research career in higher education, but they don't separate out teaching career in higher education. So hopefully next time around we'll get that finer grained analysis. In terms of research career, we can see there that 42% ended up in this position, but only 15% had that in mind on graduation. And this is likely the postdoctoral effect. And then we can see that in other professional careers, there were 25% ending up in these careers, despite only 11% having that in mind on graduation. So there's quite a disconnect between what they want, or what they wanted at the time, and what they're actually doing. Then if we look at the development and application of graduate attributes, I'm going to show you a series of these radar or spider graphs, and for each of them we can see it goes from 0 in the middle up to 100%, and we have two lines. One is the development in blue and the other is the application in black, and around the outside of the circle we have the range of attributes there. So this is across all respondents. Not all of them answered every question. That's why we have this variable response rate from 108 to 130. So when I first saw this, I was actually quite heartened. I thought actually the doctoral program is not doing too bad a job. There's not a huge difference, but nevertheless there are some gaps that are a concern, particularly around teamwork there and oral communication, which was a surprise. Self-confidence, not so much of a surprise. We're dealing with a cohort of high achievers who suffer from the imposter syndrome and a lack of self-confidence. Creativity and skills to implement change, that was also a little disappointing. Another way of representing that same data are just this graph here, which is looking at the difference between application and development for all those attributes, and we can see here the ones that are greater than sort of 10% from oral communication, independent judgment, cultural understanding, flexibility, adaptability, skills to implement change, willingness to learn, self-confidence and teamwork. So there are some concerns there. We can break it down by the different disciplinary areas. Now note that for commerce this is quite a small sample here, only 10 to 13, but there are some really big gaps between development and application. So teamwork is quite startling there, oral communication, but also a number of them, in fact. Ethics, big concern for our commerce graduates. And cultural understanding, again, these are things I would have expected to be quite highly developed in our commerce students. If we look at humanities, perhaps not surprisingly, we get much better match for things like cultural understanding and global perspective and ethics, great. But still some gaps there around teamwork and oral communication, problem solving, skills to implement change and flexibility and adaptability. When we go to health science, overall, much better match there, but again, even in health science, we're seeing teamwork come up alongside the self-confidence again and the skills to implement change. And probably the best match of all, I think, is in science there around, so most of those are quite good, but again, even their teamwork is still coming through, self-confidence and, quite curiously, independent judgment. I'm wondering if that's because they work a lot in lab teams, maybe, don't develop that so much. I'm not too sure why we're seeing that in science. The other way we carved up the data was just to look at what the end career was, and we just looked at 3 of those career types, academic career and higher education, just to see where there were perhaps some gaps. So again, a gap there for teamwork. Interestingly, written communication is overdeveloped. Some of them are overdeveloped. But again, gaps there around cultural understanding, global perspective, skills to implement change. If we look at the research career, perhaps not surprisingly, given that the PhD is all about research, we're not seeing such big gaps in those differences between development and application. They're much, much narrower. And then the final category we looked at was the other professional career. And again, here we can see, yes, research skills overdeveloped, as is academic rigour. But again, gaps for teamwork, oral communication, self-confidence, implementing change, and flexibility and adaptability. We also looked at some of the open-ended comments and just a few themes that came out. Quite a few commented, and this was mentioned in one of those earlier studies, that some of the attributes were already developed by the time the PhD was started. So, you know, a couple of quotes there around does not apply, I had them already. Completing a higher degree was the culmination of years of planning and builds on, you know, prior experience there. The other next theme was around the difficulty to enter an academic career, that just doing the PhD was not enough. So having PhD and great publications was not enough, so they needed more. The skills were developed outside of the strict research experience, so this is the teaching experiences were really seem to be really valuable, and also the training and development workshops offered by our Higher Education Development Centre were a good way to develop skills required for subsequent career and life experience. And then the final one there, skills developed related to independent working. So there was this quite strong perception that the way the PhD is structured, it is actually discouraging teamwork. And that kind of a sad comment, that last one there, that the only things it taught me was endurance, persistence and coping with working in isolation. And again, getting back to that stress study, you know, being isolated is one of the main causes of stress. So just some discussion implications from that. We actually had quite, 73% of full-time employment, and actually 71% had a job in the higher education sector. This is quite high compared to some other studies. It might be possible survey bias though. And also, as I noted, many are not in a faculty position, but rather in a research or a teaching only position. And we noted that disconnect between the desired career and the actual position at the time of survey. So 29% in academic positions compared to 55% expecting, and so on. So there was that disconnect. And then overall, we did find a reasonable match between the development and application of the graduate attributes. The core abilities we would associate with a PhD are highly developed. So the research skills, written communication, academic rigour, skills to plan work, problem solving and independent judgment. So that was the good news. They're definitely well developed. But teamwork wasn't well developed, and it may reflect that isolation, particularly in some discipline areas. And also some of those key capabilities around implementing change and oral communication were not developed, well developed. And that was a surprise, because we had assumed that most students would be presenting their work on the way through, but obviously we can do better there. We also noted the clear disciplinary differences in the development of those attributes, and that science and health science tended to produce a much more holistic, well-rounded graduate, and that probably reflects a broader range of experiences those students are getting. They tend to have greater involvement in teaching, go to more conferences, they tend to do science outreach and so forth. And then we noticed that there was the similar perceptions of the development of graduate attributes irrespective of the end career, but there were some differences there in some of those attributes. And we also noted differences for the application of graduate attributes. And it was interesting that teamwork was seen, not to be as important in academia. And maybe that's reflecting in some disciplines. Academics can be quite isolated, yet there are expectations around teamwork for a lot of curriculum work and research collaborations and so forth. So these sort of findings do have implications for doctoral research programs. I think we do need to provide mechanisms for skills to develop transferable, for students to develop those transferable skills. And it really is important in discipline areas like humanities and commerce, and the importance of career planning and discussing possible career pathways. And one of the key motivations for this Fulbright visit is to look at the North American system and look at graduate outcomes for your students to find out, because they've got that coursework component, longer programs, are they coming out with a more well-rounded profile compared to our New Zealand graduates? Okay, so that leads us to the second set of questions.
Do you attempt in any way other than the survey you described to collect data on the professional initial placement of your graduates?
No, we have not systematically done that at an institutional level. So some departments will have quite good tracking of their students, and we have an alumni office who try to keep in touch with students, but unfortunately we have not had systematic tracking beyond the survey that occurs at 18 months. So part of my research will be is looking back at graduates over the last 10 years to try and do some of that tracking and find out where they're going, what sort of careers they're involved in.
Please remind us what the overall response rate was for the survey.
55%. Yeah. So that was sent out to all graduates from that 2014 cohort. We tend to get quite good response. Well, I think they're reasonably good response rates for these, graduate surveys of around 50 to 55%. I think there are some nice enticements with iPads or some similar drawers that they can go into.
Do you have a sense of what it means that students rated cultural understanding low in development and utility?
I suspect that many of our PhD students in particular would not necessarily have the exposure to bicultural aspects of their research area, unless they were researching Māori populations, or unless they had a supervisor, who was really encouraging them to maybe learn some te reo or Māori, as we would call it there. So I think there's probably quite a low engagement, particularly, well, actually that's unfair. I actually think a lot of our international students would be actually quite keen to learn some Māori language while they're there, probably more so than some of our domestic students. Domestic students should have quite a high knowledge of cultural understanding, but our internationals, there will be quite a steep learning curve there to know about how to conduct research in Māori communities, for example.
Do you have any plans to enhance mentoring or professional development offerings or PhD capstone projects to meet these gaps in student learning outcomes?
Yes. So another project I have going on right now is to look at a more structured approach for the professional development and research training of our PhDs. So we're looking at perhaps developing some micro-credentials to use the intern around career planning, professional development of skills for particular careers. So I'm very keen on having sort of bespoke pathways depending on what sort of career that student wants to go into, because many of our students now are not interested in academic careers. So despite what supervisors might think, at least in the workshops I run, at least half of them are saying they're not interested in an academic career. So then I think we need to be finding out what are they interested in and how can we best maximise their chances of getting into those careers, and then getting them to choose professional development opportunities that will help maximise those, their desires for getting into those careers. So watch this space. We are very interested. Strathclyde have a very interesting model around postgraduate certificate in research and professional development. It's available online. That's the University of Strathclyde. We're interested in a similar kind of approach.
Okay, great. Do you consider the needs for or possibly support first generation within their family doctoral students?
No, we have not looked at that, but a priority area for us in New Zealand is supporting Māori students. So within our school we have a dedicated postgraduate advisor to support Māori students who runs a series of culturally appropriate professional development and research training events throughout the year. So that's more of a priority for us, I guess, than first and family PhDs, but that's, I'd be quite interested to learn about what's done in North America for first and family. Yes.
Okay, so we are running short on time, and I think this question is a good kind of wrap-up question, but Rachel has agreed to share her contact information, so if you think of follow-up questions you would like to ask her, she welcomes your email. So for the last question, what have you started or are you considering as a result of these responses?
So certainly those responses are leading into this careful look at what training we provide around professional development opportunities, and I'm very interested in providing more support, particularly for humanities and commerce students, so getting into those divisions in particular to look at how we can better support those students to develop things like teamwork. So if they can't do that through their PhD program, let's provide them some opportunities outside that curricula, if you like, to focus on that. So public engagement, it might be developing some outreach thing with peers. So building in some project work that they could do as part of a micro-credential where they could work with peers, so they're getting the teamwork, and they can have some public engagement or influence. I think that would be some way to help them, get the teamwork skills and get some of those other transferable skills we're really interested in.
Great, thank you so much. And you'll notice on your screen this year we are going to ask you to complete a very short survey. Upon either exiting the webinar, you will also receive it in a follow-up email, so we can get some feedback from you on our webinar series if you have suggestions for future topics. And our next webinar will be February 6th. From 2 to 3 p.m. and that will be a first look at our Fall 2017 CGS International Graduate Admissions Survey. So thank you, Rachel, very much for joining us today, and we hope you have a great afternoon.